It happened during dinner, right in the middle of that lazy conversation that drifts between relatives who've all said everything meaningful years ago and now just pass the time with stories they've already heard twice. And I don't remember what joke had just been told or who had leaned in to pour more wine. But when I dropped my fork and leaned forward to retrieve it, he placed his hand on my back in a way that was clearly inappropriate and deliberate. The contact lingered far too long to be accidental, and when I looked back at him, his expression made it clear this was intentional behavior, and the only question left was whether I'd pretend it hadn't happened. I stood up slowly, not stiffly, not enough to draw attention from the others who were busy refilling their plates and debating something meaningless, but I didn't speak, didn't give him a look or a word or anything at all. I just turned and walked into the kitchen with the fork still in my hand and my breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat, because something had changed in a way I couldn't explain. And I knew that if I stayed even 1 second longer, I'd give something away I hadn't decided how to name. Evan is 23, just out of college, tall like his father, but with that softness in the face that makes you forget how quickly boys become men. And after a fallout with his dad over something financial and something emotional, neither of which my husband ever explained clearly, Evan showed up at our door with a single duffel bag, a polite smile, and the kind of weary calm that makes people believe they should help. And of course, my husband welcomed him like family, because he is family. The son of his older brother who never really knew how to raise him. And he said it'd just be for a few months until Evan figured things out, got back on his feet, maybe looked for jobs nearby. And I remember nodding and saying something about how we had space, but even that first night, even before the sheets, were warm in the guest room. I felt it, the unease, the way the air shifted slightly when we were in the same room, not loud enough to hear, but undeniable if you paid attention. He was always nearby, but never in the way, always helpful, but never too eager. The kind of presence that feels thoughtful on the surface, but deliberate underneath. And at first I thought I was imagining it. The way he offered to make tea just before I asked, or the way he always chose the same grocery aisle I happened to be in, or how he started fixing things in the house that no one had complained about, replacing a squeaky hinge or adjusting the blinds so the light would hit the counter more softly in the morning, and each of these gestures seemed innocent, enough on their own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore, because it wasn't the behavior of a grateful guest. It was the behavior of someone timing his moves with precision, waiting for silence, watching the clock inside the house and inside me. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he knew things. I hadn't told anyone, like the fruit I preferred, nectarines, not peaches, always ripe but firm, and I never said a word about it, not to my husband, not to anyone. But one morning they were just there in the basket on the counter, arranged like he knew exactly which ones I'd reach for first. And another evening, while I was prepping dinner alone, the speaker in the kitchen, which normally played my husband's classic rock or the news, suddenly began playing a song I hadn't heard since college, one I used to hum quietly to myself during long bus rides. And when I looked up, Evan was in the doorway, not smiling, not saying a word, just leaning with that posture that doesn't mean anything on paper, but says everything in person. Sometimes I'd catch him looking when he thought I wouldn't notice, his gaze fixed not in that childish, awkward way, but with quiet certainty. And I hated that I noticed, hated that part of me waited for it, hated that I started recognizing the rhythm of his presence like it was something I needed to prepare for, because it was never overt, never rude, never something I could accuse or name out loud, but it filled the gaps between the ordinary moments, until those gaps became impossible to ignore. One morning, my husband laced up his running shoes and left for his usual route through the neighborhood, promising to be back before the coffee cooled, and Evan stayed behind, rubbing the back of his neck like his ankle was sore, and he needed to rest it for the day. And I didn't say much as I rinsed out the mugs from breakfast, but I could feel him behind me, leaning just slightly against the table like he wasn't waiting for anything in particular, and he made a comment about my appearance that was clearly inappropriate and suggestive. I tried to deflect with nervous laughter, but didn't turn around, recognizing that this was crossing boundaries. He never crossed the line in ways that people understand, never said anything you could write down and hold against him, never touched me in ways that left evidence, but he was always too close, always just near enough to test the edge of what was acceptable. And I kept thinking I'd be the one to draw the boundary, but I wasn't moving fast enough and he was too patient. And somewhere between his glances and his silences, the distance between us kept thinning, until it wasn't even clear where it had started. I kept my hands busy longer than I needed, rinsing the same mug twice and wiping crumbs that weren't really there, while his presence behind me settled into the space like smoke, quiet, weightless, impossible to ignore, and when I finally turned, I didn't look directly at him, I just asked something vague about putting the milk back in the fridge, and he nodded without a word. But the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered half a second longer than needed, it made it clear that the moment hadn't passed, it had just shifted position, and I couldn't name the line we were standing on, only that it kept moving underneath us. The days that followed were filled with routines that no longer felt neutral because he didn't need to speak to be present. He only had to move deliberately, slowly, like someone who already knew how. The other person would react before they did, and every time I caught myself responding too late or looking too long, I felt that same unease crawl back into my chest and stay there. Not sharp like guilt, but quiet like anticipation. And the worst part was realizing that I'd started adjusting to the weight of his attention without admitting it to myself. He never flirted. Not in the way people understand or expect. He didn't joke or compliment or lean in too close at dinner. He didn't ask questions that would draw raised eyebrows or force me to walk away. He just stayed one step closer than necessary and moved with the kind of patience that isn't learned but chosen. And I began to feel the delay in my own instincts, like I was watching myself from the outside, not stepping away fast enough, not correcting my posture quickly enough, not saying anything when I should have filled the silence with something, anything, to make the air reset. One afternoon, I was leaving the house to drop off a package when I felt the shift behind me. Again, the same pressure that warned me before I even heard him speak, and as I turned into the hallway, my scarf slipped from my shoulder, more from the weight of the moment than from any actual breeze. And when my scarf slipped, he approached to help, in a way that was far too intimate for our relationship. His touch lingered inappropriately on my neck and collarbone, creating a moment that was clearly beyond what was appropriate between family members, and the only thing that moved was my breathing, faster than it should have been, audible in the yaw. Quiet hallway that suddenly felt too narrow, too intimate, too sealed off from the rest of the house. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. His hand dropped. He walked past me like it hadn't happened. I stayed there for another full minute, one hand still clutching the package I never mailed, the other pressed lightly against the scarf he'd just adjusted, trying to erase the shape of his fingers from my skin without moving. That night, as my husband folded laundry in the bedroom, talking about how Evan had mentioned applying for a few jobs in Austin or maybe Portland depending on the offers, he laughed and said, "You know, he's starting to figure things out growing up. He won't be with us much longer." And I nodded without raising my head, eyes fixed on the same corner of the carpet I'd vacuumed 2 hours earlier, saying nothing while my mind whispered two truths in the same breath, one hoping he would go, the other afraid that he might actually leave. The contradiction was sharp but not surprising, because I'd been living in it for days, maybe weeks, dancing between the comfort of boundaries and the thrill of feeling them shift. And even though I hadn't asked for this and hadn't invited it and hadn't done anything that could be pointed to as cause, I knew that I'd still participated in it by not rejecting it clearly enough, by not shutting the door the moment it cracked open. And now it was too late to pretend I didn't see where the light was coming from. There was no confrontation, no big moment of decision, just the slow thinning of space between us, measured in glances that lasted too long and silences that said too much. And as I stood there beside my husband, nodding at his words, pretending not to notice the way my heart shifted at the sound of Evan's name, I realized that the boundary I was hoping would hold was already worn down in places I couldn't reinforce without tearing the whole structure apart. That night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my own reflection holding something in its eyes. I didn't want to name, something between warning and longing, and I closed the mirror cabinet too fast, as if the sound could drown out the thoughts forming underneath the surface. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. They just settled deeper into the space between what was appropriate and what had already begun to happen, one quiet moment at a time. It started with something so small it could have passed unnoticed, like most things that eventually turn heavy, because my husband had just asked Evan to take out the trash after dinner. Nothing dramatic, just a routine request tossed, out with the same absent tone he used for checking the mail or feeding the dog. And I walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, expecting to see the back door open and the bin half dragged across the tiles. But instead, I found him standing perfectly still at the far window, not holding the bag, not moving toward the door, just watching something I couldn't see. And when I stepped in, he didn't turn, didn't flinch, just kept his posture casual like we were two strangers stuck in the same waiting room. And then he said, without looking, "I thought you'd come later," pausing just long enough before finishing. "Or maybe I was hoping you'd come now." I didn't answer because there was nothing safe to say, nothing that wouldn't expose the way my skin had started registering his voice before my mind did. And I opened the cupboard like I had a reason, reached for the sponge, ran water that didn't need to be run, and listened to the silence between us expand into something that no one else in the house would have noticed, but that pressed so loudly against my spine it felt like someone should have. Later, I stepped into the hallway, near the bathroom to wash my face, just a simple routine at the end of a too-long day, and the door wasn't fully closed, just left ajar by an inch or two like an invitation left half-written, and I didn't realize anyone was inside until I heard the water stop and the quiet sound of a towel being twisted against porcelain. He made suggestive comments from the bathroom that were clearly inappropriate, essentially inviting intimate contact. I didn't stay to see his face, didn't respond with anything that could be traced or repeated. I just turned and walked back down the hall, pulse rising in my neck like it was searching for answers my head wasn't ready to ask. And when I reached the bedroom, I pretended to be fixing the bedspread, but my hands trembled against the fabric, not enough to show, but enough that I knew the difference between nervous energy and something deeper, something that had moved from curiosity to consequence. The next day, almost like a warning disguised as coincidence, my husband walked into the bedroom ahead of me and stopped short just inside the doorway, staring at something on my pillow with a look I couldn't read fast enough. And when I stepped in behind him and followed his gaze, I saw it. A navy sweatshirt, clearly Evan's, soft and worn and smelling faintly of citrus and detergent, and the silence between us stretched just long enough for my thoughts to scramble into something that resembled an excuse. So I said it flatly, too quickly, too rehearsed. He probably left it here when he fixed the lamp last week, and my husband didn't answer, just pressed his lips into that straight line that means he's letting something slide without believing it fully, and I nodded, like that settled it, though I knew perfectly well he'd fixed the lamp in the hallway, not the bedroom. That night, while setting the table for a late dinner, just the two of us after my husband had gone to return a rental tool, I felt Evan move behind me as he reached for the salt. Not brushing past, but stopping just close enough that his hand met mine where it rested beside the napkin holder, and the contact was brief but weighted, the kind that forces your entire body into stillness, and I pulled away fast, sharp, like instinct. But before I could turn, I heard him lean in just slightly and whisper low, "Why do you run when you're the one who wants to stay?" And the words weren't teasing or playful. They were said with a certainty that made my breath stick in my throat, and for one suspended moment I stood frozen, the heat from his arm still lingering near my sleeve, not knowing how to move without admitting what I hadn't yet spoken aloud. That evening, while pretending to read on the couch, trying to lose myself in something other than the silence of the house, I opened my book and found something between the pages that hadn't been there the night before, a narrow strip of paper, folded in half with neat handwriting I recognized immediately, and it read, "You read like you're looking for yourself. I could be the page you stop on." And I closed the book without breathing, fingers clamped around the note so tightly it crinkled at the edges, and I sat still for a long time before tearing it down the middle, then again into quarters, but even as the pieces fell beside me, I reached for tape and pieced them back together, smoothing each crease like it was a wound that had already scarred. The house felt heavier after that, like the air itself was tilting around corners I used to. Trust and the smallest spaces became places to fear or want, depending on the time of day or the light outside the windows, and the difference between those two emotions blurred into something I couldn't separate, not cleanly, not without tearing something inside myself in the process. The staircase creaked slightly under my bare feet, not enough to wake anyone but enough to make me pause for a second, my hand resting on the railing, my eyes adjusting to the dim light that spilled weakly through the hall from the bathroom nightlight, and as I turned to descend, I caught movement. At the top of the stairs, where the landing narrowed before the corner, and Evan was standing there, still like a thought that hadn't formed yet, his hand on the banister, his weight shifted just enough to block my path without touching me, and I expected him to pass or step back or say something that would pull the tension back into something I could pretend wasn't deliberate. But instead, he just stood there, and after a breath that didn't feel like mine, he said quietly, "I memorized the way you smell?" And the words didn't feel romantic or strange. They felt final, like a truth he'd been holding and had finally chosen to let go. I moved past him without replying, my shoulder brushing the air near his, not touching, not stopping, and the echo of his voice stayed with me longer than the sound of my own footsteps, because there was no undoing something once it was said like that, not from that close, not in that tone. And the rest of the evening folded in on itself, slow and silent, like a house holding its breath between two people pretending everything was still the same. That night, long after the lights had gone out and the dishwasher had finished its quiet cycle, I opened my eyes to a feeling I couldn't name, and when I sat up in bed, the room felt too still, like the absence of movement had created its own presence, and I turned toward the door without knowing why, only to see him, Evan, standing in the hallway, not moving, not leaning, just there, a silhouette framed by the faint light of the night lamp behind him, his shape motionless like someone watching something they shouldn't be watching. And for a long moment I didn't breathe, didn't call my husband's name, didn't reach for the blanket or the lamp or any kind of protection. I just looked at him and let the silence stretch until it wrapped around both of us like a secret neither of us had said, but both of us had already lived. Eventually, he turned and walked away, slow and quiet like he had all the time in the world, and I lay back down without turning on the light, eyes open until they burned, my body still frozen in the shape of fear or desire or some combination of both, and the line between what had happened and what hadn't blurred until it no longer mattered, because I knew he had been there, and I hadn't stopped him, and that was the only fact that mattered. In the morning, I didn't rush through the routine, like I normally would have. I moved slowly, deliberately, like every step needed to be accounted for, and when I stood in front of the mirror, toothbrush still in hand, hair not yet brushed, I didn't see exhaustion or panic or guilt. I saw something deeper, something quieter, something that had moved past the surface and settled into the bones of my reflection, and I stared at myself until the fog on the glass cleared, until I could see the sharpness in my own eyes, and I whispered, not loudly, not confidently, just enough to hear it aloud, "I'm not crazy." The words didn't echo like truth. They sounded like a question dressed up as a statement, something I needed to believe more than I actually did, because I could feel it now, not just in my chest or in the air around me, but in my hands, in my breath, in the way I'd started scanning each room before I entered, in the way I'd begun reading every silence like a sentence with a hidden subject, and I realized then that madness wasn't always loud or wild or dramatic. Sometimes it was slow and patient and quiet, a small shift in posture, a long look that stayed too long, a door left half open, a scarf adjusted too gently. It was knowing you'd crossed a line with someone without ever touching them the way a rule book would define, but knowing in every movement that something in you had already agreed to something that hadn't been said. It was the realization that your body now reacted before your mind did, that you'd started adjusting your route through the house not to avoid but to anticipate, that the sound of one voice had become more familiar than the one you'd shared vows with, and that what scared you most wasn't him, but yourself, because he wasn't following me anymore. I was beginning to follow him. Laundry was never something I minded doing, especially on quiet mornings when the house felt paused between movements and the hum of the machine offered just enough noise to drown out the rest. But as I folded shirts and sorted socks near the window seat, I found a pair that didn't belong to my husband, the fabric thinner, the color darker, the brand unfamiliar, and before I even finished laying them flat, I knew they were Evan's. Not because of anything specific, but because everything in me had already decided they were, and without letting myself overthink it. I walked down the hall toward his room, the socks warm from the dryer still in my hand, and when I knocked lightly and stepped inside, he was there by the window, shirt loose, hands in his pockets, and as I held them out, he didn't reach right away, just looked at me for a moment, too long before taking them. And when he did, his fingers brushed the inside of my wrist with a pressure that wasn't accidental, wasn't careless, and wasn't necessary. And he said, low and steady, "You know I didn't walk into the wrong room last night," pausing just enough to make me hold my breath before finishing. "I just wanted to be somewhere warm." I didn't speak, didn't stay, didn't throw the words back at him the way I should have. I just turned and left, the image of him standing barefoot by the window still imprinting itself into the inside of my thoughts, and the hallway felt tighter than before, like it had closed in behind me, keeping the heat of that moment pressed between my shoulder blades. And even as I walked back into the kitchen, trying to return to normal, the weight of that sentence kept ringing, not because it was bold, but because it was true, and I hated that I hadn't pushed against it harder. That evening, my husband left to visit an old friend across town, some kind of last-minute dinner and sports thing he was excited about, and I pretended not to mind, said the usual things about traffic, and take your time. And once the front door shut behind him, the house felt hollow in a way that was both frightening and magnetic, and I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed, chopping vegetables too neatly, listening for footsteps that never hesitated, and, sure enough, Evan appeared before I called for help, offering to mix the dressing or toss the salad, moving around the island like he belonged to every room in the house now. We stood side by side as I reached for the bowl, and his hand met mine over the rim, skin against skin, just long enough to blur the lines between coincidence and intention. And neither of us pulled away, not immediately, not with the urgency that innocence would have required, and the silence between us didn't rush to fill the space. It stayed heavy and real and full of something that neither of us wanted to name but both had started to need. And I knew I should have taken a step back, should have broken eye contact, should have reminded us both of the rules we were quietly erasing, but I didn't, and he didn't, and that choice settled like weight between us. He spoke first. Voice low but direct, the way someone speaks when they already know they won't be misunderstood. And he said, "You think you're the one controlling all of this?" And I didn't answer, because even if I had tried, my mouth wouldn't have formed the words quickly enough to keep up with my thoughts. And he stepped closer, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to bring his body into the range of mine. And I didn't back away, not because I wanted this, but because something in me had already stopped resisting, long before I noticed it had begun. He touched my face and leaned in to kiss me. Despite knowing this was wrong, I didn't resist. The kiss was deliberate and mutual, marking a clear crossing of boundaries between us. And even though I felt my hand grip the edge of the counter like it might steady me, I didn't step away, didn't recoil, didn't gasp or speak because the heat of his breath against my skin felt more real than anything I had felt in weeks, and the physical contact escalated as we embraced. Even when I briefly pulled away, I quickly returned to the embrace, making it clear this was mutual despite being inappropriate. Not thinking, not measuring, just accepting what had already happened. And in that second kiss, there was no ambiguity, no hesitation, only the sound of two people who had run out of excuses. It wasn't wild or rushed or messy. It was slow and full and terrifying because everything about it felt decided, not stolen. And when I finally stepped back a second time and didn't return, we didn't say anything, didn't explain or apologize or cover it with laughter. We just stood in the kitchen, barely apart, like the heat between us had formed a wall that neither of us wanted to walk through. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd finally admitted without using a single word. Eventually I said it, because someone had to. Because if I didn't, the silence might turn into permission, and I couldn't risk what that would mean. So I whispered it flatly, trying to inject conviction into a sentence that didn't feel true the moment it left my mouth. This won't happen again. And he looked at me, still quiet, still steady, and his reply came so simply, so calmly. It felt like it belonged to the air itself. You already know that's a lie. I left the room before my body could betray me further, walked past the staircase, down the hall, into the bathroom, locked the door with hands that finally began to shake, and turned the water on hot, too hot, hoping it would burn something. Clean, and I stepped inside with clothes still clinging to me for a moment before sliding them off, not caring that the steam filled the room so fast I couldn't see my own shape in the mirror because I wasn't trying to see myself. I was trying to erase the imprint of him, the taste still on my lips, the heat still under my skin, the pressure of his palm still anchored to my waist. And I stood there under the scalding stream until my legs gave out slowly, and I let myself lower to the tiles, sitting not from collapse, but from decision. Not crying, not sobbing, just breathing deeply and evenly like I was trying to convince my lungs to forget the rhythm he had taught them. Time passed without measurement, and eventually the water ran lukewarm, and I turned it off not because I felt better, but because I couldn't sit there forever. And I wrapped myself in the largest towel I could find, not caring that my hair dripped down my spine, not caring that my skin was red from heat, because the only thing that mattered was getting back into a version of myself that didn't betray anything. And by the time my husband came home, his voice cutting into the stillness with casual affection, I had already layered normalcy back over the surface. He looked at me from across the room, keys still in hand, jacket half off, and smiled, like he always did after a night out, like the world hadn't shifted while he was gone, and said, "You look calm tonight," with a kind of simple sincerity that landed like a weight in my stomach. And I nodded, forced the corners of my mouth into something that could be mistaken for peace, and said, "I'm just tired." Because it was the only answer that wouldn't require more, the only sentence I could say without unraveling. But inside, everything was vibrating, not violently, not visibly, just pulsing like a wire under tension, stretched too far but not yet snapping. And I knew then that nothing about what had happened would stay hidden under water or towels or silence, because it wasn't just in my head. It was in my breath, my hands, my skin, and no matter how still I tried to become, something inside me had already started to move. The morning began quietly, the kind of quiet that didn't feel restful but careful, like the house itself was trying not to breathe too loudly. And when I came into the kitchen, still wrapped in the faded robe I kept for weekends, Evan was already there, waiting without seeming to wait, holding a mug in both hands like it needed warming before being passed. And when he saw me enter, he simply extended it without a word, the steam rising between us like something borrowed from a dream I couldn't wake up from. And I took it without thanks, because it didn't feel like a favor. It felt like something inevitable, and the moment I wrapped my fingers around the cup, my husband walked in to grab his keys, muttered something about eggs and bread and back in 15, kissed my forehead without looking at my face, and left before the tea had cooled enough to sip. Evan didn't move until the front door clicked, and then, slowly, he leaned forward, against the counter, eyes steady, voice calm, the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed their lines too many times to sound uncertain, and he said, "Say the word stop, and I'll go." And the simplicity of it struck harder than anything louder could have, because he wasn't pleading or asking or demanding. He was offering, and the weight of that offer settled in my chest like something I wasn't strong enough to carry but also not willing to drop. And I stood there too long without answering, not blinking, not sipping, just holding that heat in my hands. And after a beat that stretched longer than silence, "Should?" He nodded slowly, almost like he had expected the stillness, and said, "Understood." and walked away without looking back, and I stood alone with tea that had already gone cold. Later that afternoon, when the sun had shifted just enough to change the tone of the light in the hallway, I went into the laundry room to retrieve a cardigan I needed before dinner, and as I reached for the dryer handle, I saw him already there, standing near the open machine with his hand extended, pulling out one of my blouses, the one with the sheer lace sleeves I hadn't worn in years because it never felt appropriate in this house, and he wasn't rushing or hiding the gesture, just holding it carefully like it might bruise if mishandled. And that was the exact second my husband returned, earlier than planned, stepping into the doorway with a grocery bag in one hand and confusion quickly curdling into suspicion as he stared at the fabric in Evan's grip and he asked, too directly, "Why are you touching her clothes?" And Evan didn't pause, didn't stammer, just said evenly, "She asked me to help," and the lie landed so effortlessly it echoed like truth. And I stood there behind the doorframe, visible enough to be seen but silent enough to be complicit. And I didn't correct him, didn't clarify, didn't soften the moment, just stood still and let the weight of my quiet settle between us like dust no one bothered to sweep. The air didn't clear after that, it just hung heavier, and by evening, the mood in the house had slipped into something muted but dense, the kind of atmosphere that made every movement feel premeditated, and I went to the pantry to restock the spice rack while trying to remember how normal people measure time, and the door creaked open behind me before I could finish, and Evan stepped in, probably looking for something that didn't matter, and for a few seconds, we were simply occupying the same narrow space, both pretending to be focused on mundane tasks. We had an intimate moment of physical contact in the pantry, and he made a suggestive comment about the risk of being discovered. I didn't deny his observation because I realized it contained some truth. That night, after the plates were cleared and the dishwasher hummed its usual song, I found something small and metallic left on the end table near the hallway lamp. A tiny ring fashioned from a piece of silver wire, delicately twisted but rough at the edges, not polished or meant to impress, just symbolic in a way I didn't know how to name, and I held it between my fingers for too long before sliding it onto my middle finger, just to see how it felt, and wore it for exactly an hour. Not hiding it, not displaying it, just wearing it like a thought. And when I finally removed it, I didn't throw it away or set it back. I folded it into the linen napkin drawer where I knew no one else would look, and told myself it was just a trinket, just a meaningless object, even though I had already memorized the weight of it on my hand. The night air outside was cooler than I expected, not sharp, but just enough to make my skin aware of itself, and I stepped onto the porch still in my robe, not out of forgetfulness, but out of something else. Something restless that had started following me from room to room since that afternoon, and I wrapped the fabric tighter around myself as I looked up at the sky, not searching for stars, but for something more still than my thoughts, and I heard the door click open behind me and didn't turn, didn't tense, because I already knew it was him. Already felt the change in the air before he stepped beside me, saying nothing at first, just standing close enough to share my silence. We stood there for minutes or maybe just seconds that felt longer than they were, and then he turned slightly toward me and asked, not joking, not dramatic, just with the same unsettling clarity he always used when he wanted to skip pretense, "If the world disappeared, would you stay with me?" And I kept my eyes on the sky as I answered, voice low, heart thudding quietly but firmly, "I don't even know who I'm staying with anymore." And I didn't mean it to sound poetic or wounded. I meant it literally, because I no longer felt like I belonged fully to any version of myself I used to trust. We went back inside without speaking, and sometime later, I settled onto the couch with a blanket, one that was always too thin to warm alone, and when he sat near me, not on the other side like he would have a month ago, but close enough for the blanket to stretch between us, I didn't stop him, and we had inappropriate physical contact while sitting together on the couch. I consciously chose to reciprocate his touch, recognizing that I was betraying my marriage vows. It didn't last long. It never needed to. Because that's when my husband called from the other room, voice relaxed, tone casual, asking about something. Mundane, a charger maybe, or whether I'd seen his headphones, and I pulled my hand away so quickly the fabric fluttered, and Evan didn't react, didn't speak or move to follow or look hurt. He simply sat back slowly, then stood, stretching like someone easing out of a long conversation, and walked away with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who no longer doubts the outcome. And I watched his back as he left the room, not for signs of frustration, but for confirmation of what I already knew, that he believed I would return. That night, long after the house had gone quiet again, after my husband had turned off the hallway light and rolled over in bed, after I had counted every ceiling crack and shadow shift for the third time, I found myself standing in the hallway, hand already on the doorframe before I even registered how I'd gotten there, heart steady not from peace but from inevitability, and I stood in front of Evan's room with my palm pressed lightly against the wood, not knocking, not pushing, just waiting, as if the silence could give me permission. and I waited like that for what felt like a breath and a lifetime at once, until finally I opened the door without sound and stepped inside. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I just closed the door behind me. The sheets beneath us were tangled and warm, not from urgency, but from time, and nothing in that moment felt urgent anymore, only inevitable. And I felt the calm that comes not from peace, but from giving up the fight. And even though my ears should have heard it, I didn't register the footsteps outside the door, or the creak of the floorboard in the hall, or the way the handle turned without pause. Because when you stop listening for consequences, you forget how quickly they arrive. And I didn't hear the door open. I only felt it, like a sudden cold shift in the air, and then I saw him, standing completely still in the doorway, my husband, not moving, not blinking, just staring at the bed. The next morning, my husband discovered us in bed together. The intimate nature of our position and state of undress made the situation unmistakably clear to him. I sat up slowly, not quickly enough to cover myself or shift the truth, and the blanket fell further as I moved, revealing more skin than I meant to, but it didn't matter because the damage had already happened. And when Evan pulled back slightly as if trying to make space or take responsibility, or maybe just breathe, my husband finally spoke, his voice flat, but sharp enough to cut through the tension without raising a single note. "Are you serious, Claire?" And he looked at Evan, then back at me, and his voice didn't break, but his face did. "He's practically your son." I wanted to answer, to speak, to explain something that might soften the collapse, but I didn't, because the words weren't there, and even if they had been, they wouldn't have meant anything, because Evan wasn't my son, and I wasn't his mother, and whatever we were, it wasn't something that could be packaged into shame or reason. It just was. And I wasn't my husband's wife anymore either. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way that should have made this moment feel like betrayal instead of confirmation. The silence after his words stretched longer than I thought I could bear, but I didn't speak, and he didn't yell, didn't move forward or back away. He just stood there with his hands slightly shaking at his sides, not from rage, but from something deeper, something heavier. And when he finally looked at me again, his eyes weren't angry. They were empty, and that was worse, because rage burns fast and leaves ash. But emptiness settles into walls and sheets, and doorknobs, and never leaves. He stood there for another breath, then another, and when he turned, it wasn't abrupt or loud or dramatic. It was quiet and final. And as he stepped back into the hall, he said just one sentence, one cold, even sentence that landed harder than any scream could have. "You both deserve each other." And then the door closed behind him, not slammed but firm, and the sound of it echoed louder than anything in that house ever had. I didn't cry or move or speak, and Evan sat up beside me, his face tight, unreadable, and he reached out slowly, his hands landing lightly on my shoulders like he thought maybe he could still steady me, still hold me in place. But I pulled away, not harshly, but completely, and I stood beside the bed, the sheet falling around my legs like a curtain between who I had been and what I had just become, and I whispered, without anger but full of something that felt more final than anything he had ever said, "You destroyed me." He looked up at me, still seated, still calm, but with something like triumph buried deep in his voice, and he answered without blinking, "You weren't yours anymore, Claire. You were already gone. I just helped you stop pretending." The silence in the house by evening wasn't the kind that asks to be filled with music or voices or even the clatter of careless motion, but the kind that settles into the seams of every object and corner, turning even breath into disturbance. And as I sat motionless at the edge of the bed with my hands resting on my knees and my eyes fixed on a spot in the carpet that didn't matter, I became aware of the fact that I wasn't waiting for anyone to come back or knock or explain. I was simply there because movement would mean admitting what had already been done, and I wasn't ready to inhabit the consequences fully just yet. Evan left without ceremony, without anger, without anything that might have created the illusion of drama. And when he stood in the entryway with the same jacket he'd worn that first night slung over his shoulder and his eyes on mine, he didn't flinch or offer apology or speak as someone who expected regret. He only said one sentence in a voice that was far too steady for how much damage we had caused. "I'm not saying goodbye." And then, after waiting for a response I didn't give and probably couldn't have formed, he turned and stepped out the door like a guest who had finally overstayed by more than just time. The door closed behind him with the kind of finality that doesn't echo loudly, but rests in your chest like an anchor. And I stood still for long enough that I felt my knees begin to lock, not from tension, but from the absence of anything else to focus on. And when I finally began to move through the house, I did so without really seeing it as mine anymore, passing, By framed photographs that once held meaning but now looked posed and curated and dishonest. By shelves that held books I had once loved but hadn't touched in months. And by the blanket on the sofa that still had the faint imprint of where my husband last sat, which now felt not just distant, but almost imaginary. The kitchen was colder than I expected, maybe from the tiles under my feet, or maybe from the way the light had already started to fade through the window. And as I stepped toward the table, I saw it. The mug Evan had used the very first morning he made tea for me without asking how I liked it. The same mug with the hairline crack near the handle and the faint green rim I had always meant to throw out, but never did. And as I stood over it now with my hands slightly trembling from something I no longer wanted to examine, I picked it up and held it not gently, but deliberately, studying the chipped edge with the kind of focus that belongs to people who know they are about to do something they won't reverse. There was no emotion left to soften the motion of my arm as I lifted it over the sink. No sense of nostalgia or regret or symbolism I wanted to cling to, only the need to turn something into sound that would match what had broken inside me earlier that day. And when I released it and watched the ceramic collide with the steel beneath, I didn't flinch or close my eyes or brace for the sound because it wasn't noise. It was punctuation. It was a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to write, but that had already been spoken aloud by everything that happened in that room this morning. The shards didn't scatter far, just enough to remind me that damage rarely confines itself neatly to one place, and I stood for a while staring at the jagged edges, not because I cared about the cup or what it had once meant, but because I knew without doubt that if I tried to sweep it up or throw it out or touch even one piece, I would hesitate, not out of sadness or mourning, but because it would mean the last trace of him had left the house without my permission. And so I left it there, broken, useless, sharp, and utterly final. Not because I couldn't clean it up, but because I needed to know that something had shattered loudly enough for the silence to hear it. The envelope came quietly, slipped through the mail slot like any other piece of paper. Not marked urgent or confidential, just plain white with my name and a handwriting I recognized even before I bent down to pick it up. And when I held it in my hands, the weight of it didn't betray the contents, because betrayal had already come in other forms, and this was just the confirmation. And I opened it with slow fingers. Not out of suspense, but because something in me still hoped that words written on a page would feel softer than those said aloud. But they didn't, because all it said in short, sharp strokes was this. I'm transferring the house into my name. Divorce will be filed by mail. And underneath, centered and written in smaller script, a final line that hit harder than the rest, you made your choice. I sat down after that, not because I needed rest, but because my knees folded beneath the weight of reality delivered in 14 words, and I didn't cry or call him or try to rewrite history through some desperate message I'd regret. I just placed the letter on the table and stared at the grain of the wood until the lines blurred and reformed into something that resembled the floor of the bedroom where we used to sleep. And the worst part wasn't the legality or the logistics. It was the cold efficiency, the absence of anything emotional, the implication that the past could be erased with a signature and a notary and 2 weeks processing time. I tried calling my sister that afternoon, not with the hope of forgiveness or understanding, but simply to hear someone say my name without judgment. But each attempt went unanswered, each ringtone a little longer than the last, until the screen flashed back to idle silence, and I stared at her contact photo as if it might shift and smile or blink or speak. But it didn't. And later, while refreshing messages that never came, a single new one appeared from a friend I had known since high school, someone who had cried on my shoulder when her first marriage fell apart and who had spent entire nights at my kitchen counter sipping wine and whispering her regrets. And the message, short and brutal in its simplicity, read, I can't be part of this anymore. I'm sorry, but you crossed a line. I didn't write back, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew that whatever bridge had burned between us was not one I could rebuild with words alone. And I didn't try to explain myself or offer context or beg for nuance, because people don't want nuance when they've decided what they've seen is enough. And in the quiet hours that followed, I opened my social media accounts more out of habit than intent, scrolling through feeds that used to hold birthday greetings and casual likes and inside jokes, only to find that the notifications had gone still, the messages unread, the circles of friends shrinking silently into shadows. And there was only one comment, just one, from a girl I hadn't spoken to in years, who had sat beside me in a literature seminar I barely remembered, and all she had written under an old photo was, "You used to be better. What happened to you?" I didn't answer her either. By the end of the week, the only sound left in the house was the creaking of floorboards I used to find comforting, and I stayed in the bedroom more often than not out of despair, but because the outside world no longer felt like mine. And I'd stare at the same corner of the wall for long stretches of time, sometimes focusing on the chipped paint, sometimes on the shadows that changed shape as the light moved through the blinds, and hanging on the hook by the door was his jacket, Evan's, still left where he had hung it after the last morning he touched me without hesitation, and I couldn't bring myself to wear it because it clung too tightly to the memory of skin and closeness and want. But I couldn't throw it out either, because discarding it felt like denying that anything had happened at all. And so it stayed, motionless, a monument to the weight of what I couldn't erase. One evening, when the quiet became unbearable even, to itself I pulled a book from the nightstand, one I hadn't touched in months, not because it was comforting, but because I needed to feel something familiar in my hands. And when I opened it near the center, a piece of torn paper slid out and landed on the blanket, with the gentleness of something that didn't yet know it no longer belonged. And I knew what it was before I unfolded it. The edges frayed, the ink slightly smudged, and it read the words I had once ripped in denial but taped back together like a wound I wasn't ready to let heal. You read like you're searching for yourself. I could be the page you stop on. I stared at the line until it no longer looked like language, then stood and walked to the fireplace, the slip of paper held between two fingers like a confession, and I dropped it onto the embers from a fire I hadn't replenished, watching, as the corners curled and darkened but refused to fully catch, the flame teasing its edges but never consuming it all at once, and I waited, motionless, until it finally surrendered to ash. The call came not as a disruption, but as a strange and almost disembodied sound that floated through the room long after I had forgotten what anticipation felt like, and the screen lit up with a number that took me a moment to place. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had buried it so deep in the corners of my memory that I no longer expected it to surface. And when I answered the phone, my hand moved slower than it should have, almost as if the distance between my fingers and the receiver was filled with something heavier than air. And when I finally lifted it to my ear and didn't speak, the silence that followed was not a mistake, or a delay or an awkward pause, but the kind of silence that used to mean safety and now only reminded me of how completely we had both stopped being each other's home. And I knew it was him, not because he spoke, he didn't, but because I heard that small, involuntary breath he always took before trying to sound calm. And when I whispered his name, not expecting an answer but hoping the moment might soften under recognition, I heard the click of disconnection, clean and sharp, and then the line was dead. I didn't call him back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that he hadn't meant to talk. He had only meant to hear me once more, to prove something to himself or maybe to me, that he still could. And when that moment passed, it passed completely, with no second attempt, no text to explain, no hesitation to fill in the quiet, only the certainty that he would never call again. Because some finalities come not with screaming, but with restraint, and that silence was louder than any shouted goodbye. Later that morning, sometime between wiping the counter for no reason and staring at the kettle long after the water had stopped boiling, I saw a new message notification on my phone, and my body recognized the name before my eyes finished reading it, because Evan's presence had never been about his words, but about how my body reacted before my mind approved. And the message, short and simple and typical of him, read, I still feel the way you smelled. A line that could have belonged to anyone in another context, but now belonged entirely to the version of myself I no longer knew how to carry. And I stared at the message for longer than I should have, not because I didn't know what to do with it, but because I already knew exactly what I would do. I would delete it, and I did. But only after opening it 4 times, because detachment is rarely clean and always comes with a little self-betrayal. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him, not because I forgave him, but because the part of me that might have spoken had already gone quiet. That evening, as the sky dimmed without me noticing and the house grew still in a way that no longer offered peace but rather a kind of haunted neutrality, I sat in the same armchair I had claimed for weeks, the one that faced the cold fireplace and the blank wall and nothing else, because everything I used to fill the space with, candles, music, wine, laughter, had become props in a life I no longer had the script to perform. And I didn't bother turning on the lamp beside me or brushing the hair that had fallen loose against my cheek. I just sat there. Not like someone resting, but like someone returning to the scene of a decision they couldn't undo. I wore no makeup, not because I had forgotten or rejected vanity, but because I had nothing left to conceal, and I didn't speak, didn't hum, didn't even clear my throat, because sound would have broken the illusion that time had stopped. And I sat with my legs folded under me and my hands resting on the hem of the robe I hadn't changed out of all day, and the only light in the room came from the street lamp through the blinds and the faint glow of the phone screen that I didn't touch again. And in that moment, I wasn't grieving or hoping or regretting. I was simply present, fully and painfully, in the aftermath of what I had chosen. And the only thought that moved through me, slowly and thoroughly and without mercy, was this one. I had not stumbled. I had not tripped or been pushed or pulled. I had walked, clear-eyed and steady, into every moment that led here. I had heard the warnings and the silence and the breath that caught and the voice that trembled, and still I had taken the step. Not because I didn't know better, but because some part of me believed that ruin would feel like freedom. And now that the fall had ended and there was no stairwell behind me and no floor beneath me, I understood the truth too late.